Hello, this is something I promised you that we'd have some conversations with ESL professionals in the field. And I'm here with Chandra Diaz, who teaches here at UNK, and her specialty is middle school, but she also has huge amount of experience with uh, English as a second language, particularly in issues of, I think, advocacy, civil rights, um, a lot of knowledge about the state of Nebraska in this area. And of course, for this particular course, we're talking about very general things about being an ESL professional. But I wanted to give you a perspective on people that are they're in the field, so you don't just see me all the time, because it's a lot more interesting when you see others. So I'm going to just start this out by asking you to share how did a little bit about your background, how you got involved with the whole area of ESL and even civil rights and advocacy, things like that.
Yeah, I actually teach a philosophy of education class, and I often ask my students to reflect about their experiences and why they believe what they believe, and I've done that myself. And I take it all the way back to when I was in high school, where there was an episode on Oprah where she was following a Caucasian man and a African American male, and just how they were treated differently. Treated differently. And I go back all the way back to that moment when just social justice in general really became a part of my core beliefs. So as I started college, though that kind of lens was always there in everything that I was taught. My goal was to leave Nebraska and go teach in the inner city in Denver. And I didn't. And I stayed in Nebraska, stayed in Lincoln, where the majority of my career was in Title I buildings. Title I simply means that a certain amount of population receives free and reduced lunch. And so within that construct, we always had immigrant and refugee students. And so that's just been, the clientele that I've been around. Now, I didn't get any training in ESL or ELL. So all of mine was just the deep care that I had for social justice, looking for ways, even policies and in my practice of how the voiceless continued to be oppressed and what was necessary, and how do we not look at our young people with deficits. Because I just continued to be amazed by the knowledge that we called it ESL students had. I mean, they knew way more about U.S. history, and these are middle school kids. They knew way more about U.S. history than I ever did, going way back, 70s and 80s. And I just, so that was kind of my realization that, that while they don't know English as well as we, some of their U.S. counterparts, they have all this other wealth of knowledge. So that's kind of where it was grounded. It's just that realization that I was looking at them with a deficit model, and just the importance of not doing that.
Okay, thank you. So you came at it not from preparing for it, but living it.
Living it,
yeah.
Yes.
And that's one aspect that's very important here is the issue. And I have another class coming up next week on advocacy, but that's what you've done a lot, I'm sure, is advocacy. And part of the package when you work with English learners or English language learners, or whatever acronym you use, is that you have to be aware that you have to advocate for them, because they will. I've seen this, when I was working, that certain technology would seem not to get into their room, but it would go somewhere else. And so you'd have individuals in the school that would resent that new technology might go to English learners instead of to the other students in the school. And that was a real point of conflict when I was at a certain school. And then finding out, and I'd like to ask you more about, you talked about caring, and what does it take to find out and to actually identify with your students and understand them, their families? And because a lot of people think I just teach the classes, I don't do social work. But as a teacher, you don't get to line up and avoid certain situations.
No. First and foremost, when you're an educator of people. That's primary. And so if you live by that, then you know that relationships are foundational. And I was thinking about, just the idea of advocacy and how we as educators can be the best advocates for all of our students. Well, just like any population, if you don't understand the population, then you cannot be an advocate for them. So it's conversation. And I'm a math teacher. And so I would often, think about or be envious of my English colleagues who, would find out wonderful things about children because they're writing about it. And so you can't make excuses. I never made excuses for myself. So you have to be intentional in how you build relationships with young people. And so you have to embed those kinds of pieces. Even if you're a math teacher, if you're a PE teacher, there are no excuses. You build relationships with students so that you can best meet their needs academically, socially, all of it.
Yeah, that's a very important thing. Just emphasize that those teachers. A thing I heard was sometimes I'd hear people saying, "Oh, those are your students. Mm-hmm. They're not my students, and they're all our students." So when all these things that you may think are platitudes about teaching every student or teaching all students are in fact real, and if you don't agree with that, then you are discriminating against that group. You're ignoring them or sending them to another room. I've seen that where somebody would send kids that would come early. They'd be upset because the parents had to bring the kids early and they didn't want them in their room, so they'd send them to the ESL teacher. And they said, well, I don't have to have them until 8 o'clock, so they need to go down there. They're your students. And that was just poison to me, that I get angry about it. I like to explore some other things because we're Facebook friends and I see things you're involved with all the time. Very impressive. What are some experiences you've had with students achieving very special things? I've had students in ESL that go on to become doctorates. And so, and expectations is the word I guess I'm looking for here. Yeah. That people sometimes think low expectations, only certain people are going to be successful. And you mentioned about the level of knowledge students have. And people say, yeah, but they don't speak English very well, or they're not quite as advanced. But I'll just let that go. Or organizations or stories, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to approach it sort of in the more complex way of looking at EL students, because you have this population that possibly started in English language learner classes early when they got here, and then are out of it at some point. Then you also have students who get here in high school who are in the program. And so I want to address some of those complexities too. And also citizenship status. So there's three that really stand out to me. So in middle school, I had a young lady in my class, and this was the start of when, I want to say, was it 2006, 2005, 2006, the year before Nebraska passed our own version of the DREAM Act. And I believe we were the 10th state in the nation to do that. I believe. And in middle school, she was very quiet, but as a school, we advocated to our principal that we were going to leave early that day and we were going to take our students down to the Capitol and march. And so she went, and so that she was in 8th grade at that time. Well, it took a while for that legislation to go through, and there were several marches after that. And when this young lady was a senior, she announced at the rally that she's undocumented, and she was one of the main leaders of that march. And so she continues to advocate. So that was something that I thought was really powerful, is the importance of sometimes stepping out of the way of students because they have incredible gifts. And so she is one, and she continues to advocate for immigration and policies as well. The second one was a young man who I met when I was an administrator in a high school. And I recognized his name right away because he had a 4.0 and he was a Latino student. And it was rare for me to see young men with 4.0s. And so I was like, oh, I gotta meet that kid. Anyways, a couple years later, his grades started to really plummet, and found out that his father had been deported. And so with the resources of the community, we really wrapped ourselves around him. But again, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have advocated for him unless I actually knew about those resources. So as educators, it's really important to know where you live, what resources are available, who are the contact people. So we wrapped ourselves around this young man, and he graduated from a university in Nebraska with an engineering degree, and he's still undocumented. But what's really powerful about him is that I remember the day that President Obama had passed or allowed the opportunity for young people to make themselves known and become documented. And we had a conversation. He was really scared. He said, what if in 4 years Obama's not in office, and now they have my information? And so, fast forward to now, I can only imagine how he feels. It kills me. It tears me up inside. And now I didn't give him direction on that. I just said, it's up to you. It's an opportunity. But for a lot of young people, they continue to be afraid. And as teachers, we continue to support. But on the success part of that, he did get an engineering degree from a university. So very proud of that young man. The other one came from, I want to say, Iraq, when he was a freshman in high school, was an ELL. And we know how hard that is, at least for my experience. When you're in ELL classes in high school, you don't get credits for that, right, towards graduation requirements. This young man went through the whole ELL program, graduated Lincoln Public Schools in 4 years, and attended actually UNK and graduated from here. So those are the kinds of success stories that I think are really, really important, that people have an incredible will to survive, an incredible will to achieve.
Yes, I've had similar situations. I had a student, and that's been years ago. So she was married and then was in an abusive. Her young husband was very abusive, and there was actually an act that protected women that were going through it, so they wouldn't because it'd be a threat that the husband was angry in the divorce and he would turn her into immigration. Mm-hmm. So she was given safe haven because of the law. And then she later, and I remember she had to pass the praxis to be a teacher. And she wasn't even close on the math, but she was very good on everything else. And she studied math for about 1.5 years so she could pass the praxis. And it wasn't easy, but I find many students in general won't do that. Mm-hmm. They'll just give up. But she studied math until she had it mastered. and she got a passing score, and she's a teacher, or I think counselor now, actually. Married a minister, and she wonderful student, but her will to survive and to prosper, she was not going to give up for her future family and herself. And so that pointed out to me the importance of protection, legal protection for students, so they have an opportunity. And we have to admit right now, it is scary. And we don't have to get into hardcore politics, but it's pretty hardcore for these students. So it is rough. Well, those are some things I wanted to highlight, because I think the stories are important. It's, I can talk about different ways of teaching and different approaches in language instruction, and that's all fun, but to me it is, and I hope it is to others. But what's really interesting is the individual stories and the situation students, where you have latchkey kids who have to go and take care of their little brothers and sisters at home, so they can't do extracurricular activities, or they have to translate for their parents, and of course they shouldn't. A 7-year-old can't negotiate a bank loan. If they could, that would be one heck of a future banker. But those are some of the things that I think are important, that the aspect of being an ESL teacher or having EL students is finding out where they're from, what the resources that you mentioned in that community are, and looking for. I have something about when you were looking for resources. What kind? I mean, did you sometimes find individuals that were great resources as opposed to a church-related organization or some kind of I found individuals that, because of their background and their commitment, whatever that reason is, they're just great for helping students. And that you as a teacher, you can't just do your job in school and go home. It's taking the time to interact with people in the community and the parents of the kids too.
Very good point. And that's exactly what it was. If you're involved in your community, you're going to know who the people are that are doing the good work. And once you get to know those people, they're just a phone call away.
And they can take over situations. Yes. They can help over the weekend with kids. I've had students, it was poverty, not necessarily, but some of the teachers I know, I knew some over at Grand Island, they used to make little packs for their kids to take home. So they'd have something to eat and something to read and something to do. They'd get some inexpensive books or get them to check out a library book. And so because they literally didn't have food to eat at home, or not enough. And so they get a couple of canisters of fruit or healthy food, but just pencils and stuff to write and some crayons. And it wasn't very expensive, but it was like it sent the message that we value you and that we know things are tough at home, because you can't assume that there's a meal on the table in some cases, not to mention you can have really negative abusive relationships too, or just simply loneliness because of the isolation of children, even young children. But I think we pretty much covered what I was thinking about. I think, Chandra, you'd be, if somebody had a question, wanted to talk to you, you'd be glad to talk to them. We have a lot, and you teach 803, so the philosophy of education. So some of you are going to be taking 803, I believe, in advertising when I'm on television. So, yeah, so we got 803, and what else? And you're middle school.
Yeah, I'm on middle school.
So that's probably the most fun bunch of people you can have.
We are, yep.
That'd be a little crazy.
Yeah.
or a
There,
lot?
there are just a few other things that I wanted to address, just two things.
Yes, go ahead.
Because I've also served as an administrator, and kind of getting to your point about how there might be some teachers in your building that will say these are your kids. And I was also alluding to the issue that the EL program is much more complex than what sometimes schools see it as. And here's one population that I think sometimes gets overlooked, and it's people like me who were, so you're going to have students in your building that may not be in your ELL program, but their home language is something other than English. And so those students, like me, often are actually not often, have always been overlooked because we also mimic the low vocabulary acquired, very similar to ELL students. And so I would encourage you in terms of advocacy, I would encourage you to have conversations with your administration to also look at that population as well. Because when you say, well, I was just thinking when you were saying, you know, this is your student, these are your students, and the reality is they're all of our students. And something that I've also found myself saying to my TE 100 students is, how many of you are going to be special education teachers? And only like 3 hands were raised. And I said, wrong. I'm like, you're all going to be special education teachers, even though that might not be your endorsement, because those students will be in your class. So the same thing is, how many of you are ELL teachers? Everybody. Because you're going to have people like me who were never in the program but have needs, and you're also going to have students that are in the ELL program that are also going to be in my math class or the PE class or the art class, which is where they tend to get placed when they first come, in addition to their ELL classes, depending on what model you have in your school. So that's one piece. How can you advocate for more students? And the other piece too is when you're getting to know students, think of trauma-informed experiences, because a lot of our students are experiencing trauma. Trauma, whether it is the refugees and the experiences they had in the refugee camps that they came from, or it just simply are undocumented students who, with all the political things that are happening, are worried every single day.
They live in fear.
They live in fear every day. So those are some of the things that I would encourage you to also look at.
So, and that means keeping track of current events, because some of these things are very upsetting, and I know I get upset watching CNN or different sports or other news groups. But I've noticed that, you know, the issue with the refugees and the kids in the camps in El Paso or wherever that is, that was a major discussion on a sports ESPN, because the people there, I got to think of their names, Stugatz and this other guy, I'll think of it later. But they have a morning on the ESPN radio, and they're all Cuban immigrants, and they acknowledge that Cubans for a long time got preferential treatment, but they weren't held for very long at all. But that's kind of changed even for them, and now they are they're very upset about the treatment of the kids, and you know, they're just so shocked that when you see things spilling over into sports, when they're not talking basketball all the time or baseball or football, but they're talking about social justice, it's got to be a big issue that's coming out. So, any other points, or did I? I know you had a lot, but
yeah, no, those were good.
I just want to thank you, and we might do more of these, you know. And, I've always wanted to do these, but I've only done. I had our reading specialist, Carrie. She talked about reading issues in the schools. It wasn't even necessarily ESL. It was just general strange and weird programs that are promoted to help reading or not, you know. So I'm going to end this now. I know that I make long videos because I talk a lot, but you talk well, and that's good, because you know, okay, well, I'm an expert at ending things, so I'm going to just end this. Thank you very much. And then if you have any questions, be sure to email me, and we're going to do a group discussion on Zoom so we can talk about this further. Okay.